It's 7 o'clock. Welcome everybody. We'll get John later.
Okay.
We have some guests.
Yeah, we have some seats
over
over here.
here.
Sure didn't make an entrance,
Okay. I'll introduce our guests tonight. We have James Mello. Okay. Patty and Sandra Lesser. I'm not doing a good job here at all. Dave and Ed Bernitsky. There, okay. Marlon Shorty Umberger. Where's one back there? I knew I recognized you. I just couldn't remember from where. Michael Ward. We have Mitch Troutman and his mother, Mary Ann Troutman. Welcome, all of you. Okay. Our speaker, Mitch Troutman, is a 2004 Line Mountain graduate with a bachelor's in a teaching certificate, right? And now living in Pittsburgh. He is a descendant of bootleg miners. Mitch is the author of Bootleg Coal Rebellion, The Miners Who Seized an Industry, 1925 to 1942. The foreword in his book, set by Carl Weber, reads, using local newspapers and oral history interviews, gifted historian Mitch Troutman tells the story of the miners as well as the women, children, storekeepers, truckers, and priests who participated in the Bootleg Coal Rebellion. Great read. I think we're in for a treat tonight. Let's take a look. Get all my stuff together here.
I had the same problem.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you for having me, everybody. I just talked a lot about in high school earlier today, which I expect you guys to be much more talkative than they were, because they you know. Yeah. So first off, who in here, is anybody here a teacher or former teacher? I tend to get a bunch of those hands, you know. Anybody who here crossed county lines to get here? Not so many. All right. Yeah. I mean, I can see from your list. What do they call you? Evillians? Evillians? Well, that's what I'm going to call you. All right. So, yeah, my book is The Bootleg Coal Rebellion, about a time when the company mines closed and people started digging their own mines all over the region, including in Upper Dauphin County. And so far in my research and experience, it really seems like if you're from one of these towns where this happened, your family was involved one way or another. Because a lot of towns, I can't speak that much to, you know, Lycans and those down there, just because I don't know the specifics as well, but like in Trevorton, there was one mine, and when that one mine closed, that's it. You know, you had a couple textile mills that didn't necessarily pay that much. It's really nice. And you had a couple textile mills and some other things, but when the one mine closed, or in Shamokin, they had, I think, 7 mines at the time, and there were only 2 left, you know? Things really bottomed out, and they tried everything they could, everything you try today, you know, they tried to write some grants, you know, they tried to maybe start another business or something. They got some make-work programs, like building roads and stuff like that, to try to keep people busy. There was charity at first, you know, places like the American Legion or different churches would write to other posts and other churches asking for help. But then when the Depression hit everybody, that kind of dried up too. They tried working through the UMW, the Mine Workers Union, and for a while they were collecting, you know, everybody was pitching in, and at some point they were taking assessments, you know, like extra money out of their checks to give to unemployed people. But again, eventually there weren't enough people working there either. And so the reason the book starts in 1925 is because the miners went back to a thing they had been doing then. In 1925, there was a huge strike. It went through the winter, the whole anthracite region, and 6 months, I think, maybe 1 day shy of 6 months. And one of the things the miners would do during wintertime strikes like that is they would go dig coal and use it for themselves, share it with their family, sell it if they could. And in the book, I don't want to make everybody out to be a hero, because they're not necessarily heroes, you know? And they did, when they mined that coal illegally, they did it every way they could. Some of them would dig their own small little mine somewhere out in the mountain where there's a small outcropping, where the coal, you know, is too small for the company to have bothered with. But some of them would break into the mine itself and start mining coal there, or go dig it out of an existing strip mine. And so that's what they started doing when nothing else worked. And at first it was at night. You know, they would cover up their holes with brush. They would hide all their tools, take them home with them. And the real problem was, as you know, if you've seen some mines, is they have all this, you know, all this waste, all this coal and other stuff that comes out of there that's not coal or not usable. And if you have a big pile, well, then people are going to know where your mine was. So they had to take that home with them too. A lot of them would like shake it out as they went, you know, spread it. But as things just got more desperate, and as other things didn't work out, people started doing it in the middle of the day. And I think it was sort of a thing where, you know, you were, you know, maybe over in this town you were doing it at night, you were bootlegging coal, but then you heard that somebody in, you know, the next county over, they stood up to the coal and iron police. You know, they said, what have we got to lose, you know, get out of here. And gradually, well, not that gradually, really over about a year, people just all started doing it in broad daylight, started selling bootleg coal right on main streets and towns. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say, which is why it's a book, you know. I want to read this one piece, though. All right, so this actually comes from Western PA, but I think it's a really fun story that kind of describes their mentality at the time. So, in Western, this is from George Corson, the folklorist, if anybody's ever heard of him. He actually started the Kutztown Folk Festival. But in Western PA, there's a story about the last day in a worked-out mine. The lone last grizzled miner puts the last lump of coal from the old diggings into the worn-out pit car. Threw the broom and the rusty pick and shovel on top of the load, guessed at its weight, and with the aid of a faithful dog harnessed to the car, the mine mule had died, laboriously dragged the load to the old tipple and dumped it into the last rail car below in the rusty siding. The tipple at that very moment collapsed, and the pit car dropped into a heap and fell to pieces. The old dog died, and then the grizzled miner didn't know what else to do, so he went on strike. And I don't know, that's like a little bit of how people's attitudes were, though, you know? They stuck together. They had, you know, they stuck together because of how their communities were and how small these coal towns are. Everybody's together, but also because of the history of having the union and knowing, like, okay, I might not like this guy over here, but if he does good, I do good. If he does bad, I do bad. You know? And so same as anybody, you know, they didn't like all their neighbors either. They weren't any different from us, but when they went out to the mountains, they realized they had the power in numbers at a certain point. There were just so many of them that the jails filled up. Over here, I have two poster boards you can take a look at. I got some photos, maps, and then some articles. And I think one of them here, yeah, more men than cells in prison found in holes. They had to stop arresting them because they didn't have anywhere to put them. And I have a story in my book that I believe is from Sunbury, from a cop who arrests a guy, takes him into the jail, does the paperwork, and leaves. And when he walks out, he sees the guy and his friends laughing at him, you know, laughing at the cop. Because they would just let him out, give him $1 fine maybe, you know. And especially in Northumberland and Schuylkill counties, you know, where there's not much else going on. I'm curious how, you know, Dauphin County dealt with it. I don't know that much about how the county level did it, but But certainly in the towns and things, judges were sympathetic, all sorts of people were sympathetic. Miners started calling for jury trials if they got arrested, and people wouldn't convict them. I mean, sometimes they would. Some people went to jail, but a lot of them got away with it. But the miners didn't see themselves as stealing. In their mind, the coal company, they didn't put the coal there. And in their minds, they were taking the risk, risking their lives. They were putting in the labor to get it out. And that, it wasn't an issue when they had the jobs, but now that they didn't, they felt like they had to decide, is it this company's property rights, or is it like this community's surviving? And they chose. Now, the coal companies from back then, you're probably aware, but I was talking about Meckley's in the school earlier, Like we have these local companies around that do some big things, but you still run into those people. Back then, these coal companies are owned by J.P. Morgan, groups like that. And so they're far away, you've never met them. So again, the sympathy went to the miners. So I have this film I want to show you. It's a newsreel film. So during the Great Depression, one industry that did really well was the film industry, because people were eager to take the little money that they had and go escape for a while, right? And the movies had just started getting sound not that long ago. And then one of the things they had was the newsreel service, where you literally go to the movie theater to watch the news. They watched this, the March of Time, it was called. They'd screen it all across the country at the same time, same weekly program. And so in 1935, they came up to Shamokin and made a 6-minute video that was then shown across the country. One thing I want to say before showing it to you is that some of it are reenactments, right? And you'll figure out which parts are. So,
Wait, hold on. I'm going to turn the light on.
Oh, thank you. And I have a version with subtitles that you can find on the internet, but I couldn't get the subtitles to work on this.
That's good.
The March of Time. Pennsylvania lie billions of tons of unmined coal. Almost all the anthracite in the United States today. For nearly 10 years, most of the mines have been shut down, their miners jobless. Yet today, the hard coal towns of Pennsylvania are not bankrupt. Stores stay open late, cars crowd the streets, the mining people are decently dressed. Long before federal and state governments began handing out billions of dollars for relief, these people found a way to help themselves. What keeps them self-supporting is a continuous procession of motor trucks, rumbling day and night out of the mountains. In these trucks are thousands of tons of bootleg coal, stolen from the shut-down mines. When the mines began closing down 10 years ago, the miners lived on their savings, hope for better times. As the abandoned collieries crumbled into ruins, the miners faced starvation. The companies let them pick over the waste heaps for coal, to feed their home fires, to warm their children, and their churches to which they could no longer give money. Then the jobless miners started trading coal for life's necessities. When depression deepened, the miners went a step further.
Well, I got a new job now.
Yeah?
Yep, right for myself. $3 a day.
On their abandoned properties, companies posted trespass warnings, but the miners pushed past them, dug out coal from the hillsides, which they felt owed them a living. At first, they dug furtively. At night, they sold their this illegal coal business might keep families alive. Today, the business of stealing coal has become a community enterprise. 25,000 men, organized in crews of 4 to a dozen, using crude but effective homemade machinery, bring the coal to the surface. Other workers, young and old, prepare it for market, for sale in New York, Baltimore, Washington, as far north as Boston, for $2 or $3 less per ton than legally mined coal. Though the industry now grosses $50 million a year, the bootleggers firmly believe they are only taking what belongs to them. Time and again, to protect their properties, the mine owners order company police to drive the bootleggers from their workings.
Well, how about it, fellas? You coming out of that peacefully? He says, how about it, fellas? All right, then. I warn you. The company means business this time. So be it, brother.
When the police fail and local courts refuse to interfere, the company sends men with dynamite to blast the bootleg holes. In defiant answer, the bootleggers sink their shafts deeper into the earth, into virgin seams of rich, gleaming anthracite, worth millions to the mine owners. When court action seriously threatens their business, the bootleg miners organize to fight it.
Men, we are going to fight this injunction to a finish. We're organized now. Our energy is as good as theirs, and so is our boys. Our grandfathers worked these hills, and so do we. If they try to put us all in, show 'em. What's going to be the signal, Chief? Or a blast of that pure whistle. When you hear it, come and fight for your cause.
Asked to mediate, journalist Joe Agor brings about an agreement between the bootleggers and the owners of one mine company. The bootleg chief agrees that his men will leave their holes when the owners promise to give them honest jobs. But this agreement affects only 350 men and 2 shafts. As the trucks of the 25,000 remaining bootleggers continue to rumble out of the hills, Pennsylvania waits to see if the Shamokin settlement will lead the way out of the most menacing industrial crisis in the United States today.
Which coal mine in Shamokin was that agreement at the end about? I think it was about the Henry Clay mine, and the company didn't end, so it didn't happen. Sorry, my mom was just commenting on that.
I said it probably just shows that I didn't read his book yet.
She helped edit it. She read the book. I also forgot to ask, anybody here a descendant of miners or have mined themselves? Yeah? Anybody have mined themselves? Yeah? Okay. Where at?
Silver Creek.
Okay. Independent?
My parents had it, and then it was leased out afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. few things I want to add. This video does a lot of work for me, which is great. I want to add that this is just the lower region that did this. Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Hazleton, they weren't doing this. I mean, some people tried, but the big stuff was happening down here. And that's why I really love this so much is like, it's not just local history. I mean, it happened here, but this is national history. Nobody else did anything like this. Nobody else had like the skills and the attitude to do something like this, you know? And yeah, and just the way people stood up for themselves, I'm really proud of them. So some other things I want to add. They get into trucking there a little bit. That's what made this whole thing work. Is the coal companies and the railroads were owned by the same people. So companies like Reading Anthracite refused to use trucks. They were trying to shift all their money into the railroad. And so trucks, it's kind of new that people could afford them. And so the bootleggers had to have the corner on trucking. So they were able to take their coal and sell it in cities and rural areas from Connecticut to Maryland, right? Or even D.C. I found some records from D.C. But the funny thing is, they didn't know people in all those places, right? So what they had to do was, after somebody saved up and got themselves a truck and got some bootleg coal, they had to go, Mitch, can you turn that off? I just want to stand over here without it in my eye. Thank you. He's also Mitch.
Want me to turn the projector off altogether?
Yeah.
We're done?
Don't mind. Thank you. So since they didn't necessarily know people, what they did is, I haven't heard that anybody's been going down to this certain neighborhood of Baltimore. Go down there and just knock on doors. You know, hey, we got coal. It's $2 less a ton than the company coal. It's the Great Depression. Even if it wasn't, people want a deal, you know? And so they built up their customer bases that way, but then people in the cities did the same thing. They followed them back up to the region and would literally drive around the coal hills looking for bootleg mines. And that's why people had basically, if you were old enough and able, man or woman, to do some work, you were doing some work. And what they do with the little kids is have them stand out by the road. Yell if there's cops. If it's a trucker, wave them down. We want to sell them some coal. And so that's how people from Philly and Baltimore and all of that found their people up here to sell to. There was actually even a lot of black truckers coming from Baltimore who were participating in this. So it was an industry up here that kept us afloat, and it kept them afloat too. So the companies didn't give up, though. Of course not. They tried everything they could to stop it, and if the rest didn't work, and if blowing the holes shut didn't work, because people would just dig them again, they started moving in stripping shovels, right? And the idea was for the company that, one, we can get this coal cheaper that way, but two, we can destroy all those bootleg holes while we do it. There's about 12 different cases. I should check my number on that, but something like that, dozen or so different cases where when they tried to do that, towns would bring the fire whistles, whatever they had, and people would come out of the woodwork and surround the shovel and stop it from going in. And sometimes that wasn't enough, and so they loaded it full of dynamite and blew it up. This happened all over, but honestly nowhere more than Donaldson. Sort of near here, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they blew up more than anybody else. Over Donaldson.
I'll tell my Aunt Anya about that. She lives at Tremont.
Yeah. And so the bootleggers, it kind of showed you a little bit too, but they also formed unions. There's many reasons to do this, right? Sometimes it was to negotiate with the coal company whose land they were on. Maybe they could work out something to, sell the coal through the company. Who knows? Maybe it was to deal with the courts. They form a union, pool dues, and hire lawyers. A big thing was mediating disputes between people, because you know how that gets, right? All this business is done in cash, and this guy says he owes this guy so much money, and try to work that out before it turns violent. Also in this set a base floor price, so that people weren't undercutting. But there was nobody who ever got rich in bootleg coal. Nobody who ever made that much money. There was a lot of money moving through it, but that's just because it was so big. At one point, it was about 10% of the whole industry, of like all anthracite was being bootlegged. And at that time, the biggest coal company, 10%, that's how much they were producing, you know? So it was pretty wild scale. Let me see where I wanted to go real quick. Okay, well now that I got to the bootleg unions, I was trying to look something up specific that I had seen in my research while doing this book about Elizabethville. And it didn't, I don't think it made it into the book, or if it did, it's just a sentence or so. But have you guys heard of the 1934, you might call it the textile strikes, or you might call it the Elizabeth Gratz riots? Anybody? Yeah? Okay. I found more articles than I could read today that I hadn't seen before on it. So let me tell you what I pieced together, okay? Is textile mills in this town went on strike. Not everybody in the mill went on strike, but the majority of them did. And they were striking just to get union recognition. And that had been going on, I'm not sure for how long, but over in Lycans, they were having the big UMW convention, the United Mine Workers, the official union. And somebody made a motion, hey, let's quit this and go help them. And so they did. I mean, over some people's objections, I'm sure. You plan a big meeting for a year and everybody leaves. But they did, and I think, 60-some people drove over here to Elizabethville to join the pickets in front of the, I don't know if you call them mills or what, but when I was looking in the names, I think I saw or heard some of them around here, like I think Weavers was one.
There's photos back there of that.
Okay. Of the mill?
Yeah, of the factory.
Okay, photos back there in the factory, cool. And so when they had all those people here, who knows what happened, but definitely the police started beating people and killed one man from the UMW, who was Leo Sitko from Mount Carmel. But it also happens, this is disputed, that the governor's wife was there, because she was a big supporter of textile workers too. Pinchot, Cornelia Bryce Pinchot. Now I'm not actually sure if she was there that day, but she was definitely there at some point, but I think they got a little sensational and said, oh yeah, she was right next to the guy. I don't know. But they did arrest a bunch of people, and she did pay the bail. So that's what they call the Elizabethville riot. And here's where it comes into the bootlegging. I mean, a lot of times bootleggers were involved in stuff, but they weren't saying, yeah, we're bootleggers, right? Like, why would you do that? But the textile union sent some people over to the other big union meeting in Tremont, which was the bootleggers union meeting, and asked them to come help out in Gratz. And so they were having a strike in Gratz, and I don't know, some people got in fights and stuff. It didn't sound as dramatic as here, but they called that a riot too. When the bootleggers came over, that was a special day that we don't celebrate anymore. Funny enough, do you know this?
I don't.
A special holiday from October 29th is Mitchell Day.
Oh, yeah. That's what like the boys in high school play each other football.
Whoa, that's powerful. Yeah. So John Mitchell was the famous leader of the Mine Workers Union in 1902 when there was the huge strike. And so for decades afterwards, people celebrated Mitchell Day. I don't think it was to commemorate his birthday or anything. I think it was to commemorate like the strike ending or something like that. But so when the mill people heard that the bootleggers were coming on Mitchell Day, they said, "Okay, we'll just shut down. We'll just shut this down today. Don't worry about it." But that's all the farther I got. I don't actually know how these things wound out, either in court or if the union won or any of that. But it is pretty wild. I mean, Elizabethville has stuff going on, but I tend to think of Gratz as a very, if I sat something on the sidewalk, I think it might be there next year, And so it's pretty wild to think of a few hundred people carrying on in Gratz. So anyway, that's the little bit of Elizabethville history that I found that I'm so happy to share with Elizabethville. Let's see. Well, I guess I'll just just tell you, so I already told you the reason I started in 1925. There's a big strike, and they were bootlegging through that. What happens in 1942? Anybody? World War II. And so, even shortly before that is when they start up the draft and everything. Bootleggers, they're unemployed technically, so a lot of them are getting drafted. And also factories that had been closed are being reopened and retrofitted to produce bombs and things like that. And so it really soaked up the unemployment, you would say. And that's kind of what brought this period to a close. Now, after the war, people do come back and bootleg again, and that goes on really till the 70s until they all basically turn legal. That's the independent miners. But I had to end the book somewhere, and also it was never as big as it had been during the Depression. But to the best of my knowledge, there's 3 independent mines left open. R&W is one of them. That's near here, right? No? No. Anyway, so the people who are still mining today, again, very few of them, and it's probably not going to last that much longer. They're really using the same methods as the people in the video. The tools are a little bit better, but they're not like that much better. Over in Wyoming, where they have these huge open pit mines, they can pull out like 100,000 tons of coal a day, right? Right? Yeah, I mean, these are the biggest machines on Earth, literally, doing that work. And in the bootleg times, they were getting maybe 3 tons a day per person. And even today, like at a small independent mine, they might get 15 tons a day per person, right? It's really almost like not even comparable how different it is. But yeah, so that's what ends it with World War II. And I think I'll just open it up for questions. I mean, there's plenty of other things I could add, but I think some of you read the book, and I'm sure some of you have questions. So. Oh, yeah, and I have books for sale. Thank you. She's my #1 bookseller, my mom.
What was the name of the one colliery in Trevorton?
Oh, North Franklin.
And that was owned by the P&R CNI?
Yeah, it was, I think at some point, well, I do a chapter where I focus on Trevorton just as an example of what happened to towns, and that ended up burning down, mysteriously, but they got a lot of insurance money. But I know it was rebuilt again later in maybe the 50s, and I don't know that history as well, but I think it was owned by Stevens Coal Company later years. Other questions?
Was Franklin an entire company? Franklin Coal?
Oh, North Franklin?
Yeah.
No, it was, that was actually, Trevorton was set up differently. It was Redding, Anthracite, who owned it, but they started the mine like before they started the town, and then people could like buy in, you know? It was, Trevorton came later than a lot of other towns, basically.
That wasn't the Reading Anthracite, that was the P&R, the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company.
Yeah.
And then it turned into Reading Anthracite.
Yeah,
in the 1960s, I think, or 50s.
They changed their name so many times that I just stuck with Reading Anthracite once to kind of cover it. But yeah, if you get down to the details, yeah. Other questions?
My husband's family from Pottsville, during the Great Depression, they would go into mines and pull the chimneys that were there to keep it upright.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be bootleg, right?
Yeah. I mean,
they would be bootlegging coal.
Yeah, I mean, unless they had permission. Yeah.
No, and unfortunately, no, and unfortunately, it caved in. Yeah. And one of the sons was lost.
Oh.
They had got the father out, and he wouldn't let any more of his sons go in, and that was a wise decision on his part. Yeah. So, because then it was completely.
That Fred's grandfather you're talking about?
Yeah, it would be, yes.
Yeah, so a lot of bootleggers would go into the mines, maybe the very mine they had been employed in, and bootleg there. Sometimes they would use main entrances. Sometimes they would dig their own mine and then just cut on over to get into there. They called it the old workings. Also, other bootleggers, they needed materials, so they would go into the company mine and just steal anything. And I would say anything that's not nailed down, but they were taking the nails. You know, like they were taking timbers out. You know, like those are to hold up the roof. Now, if it's been used once already, I would think, you know, there's a little bit of weakness to it, but it wasn't about like, oh, what's the best timber we can get out here? You know, it's like, let's get back in there and get this coal mine. And again, with the bootleg mines, I mean any mine, like when you start it, you're not making money on day one. It might take you 2 months to hit the coal that you're trying to get, and that's only if you had a good intuition about where you were going to find it. You know, so there was a lot of dead work, they called it. A lot of days where they were mining but not having any coal to sell. And, you know, there's nobody giving you a paycheck, right? But yeah, and it was also quite dangerous, obviously, as you may have heard or guessed. But there's a funny thing I found, though. So when you're working for the main company, the coal company, and you have a union, if you smash your finger, you report that, right? Because, oh, well, if my hand goes and falls off or something, then I want it on the record that I smashed my finger. If you work in a bootleg mine and you smash your finger, you're definitely not telling anyone. Definitely not writing it down, right? So you can't really compare those because we don't know, but what you can compare is the fatalities, how many people died in the mines. Because that was covered in the newspaper. The papers around here, a lot of the editors like really were supportive of the bootleggers and covered things. And so the fatalities are all in the newspapers. And when I compared those numbers to the regular companies, I was surprised that it was about equal. There were a lot of deaths in both of them, right? There's more commentary on how bad the company mines were, really. But the thing was, the bootleggers more often died underground, whereas people at the company more often died above ground in the machinery. Yeah. Oh, on that note, any other questions?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, then I'll get to you.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason I asked about Franklin is that when you cross the Mark Street Bridge in Lycans, you got into a flat area, and there was a building, or this is a long time ago, so I'm really scrapping here.
Mm-hmm.
There's either a building or a tank or something that had Franklin on Franklin coal, and I just wondered if.
Yeah, I don't know the ins and outs of any individual mine. I really don't know, especially in the post-war years. Wall Street sells this stuff off. It gets sold from one person to the next. At some point, Fruit of the Loom bought one of these companies because they wanted it as a loss on their balance sheet. It's really weird. You know, so it's impossible for me to follow all that. I'll get to you after him.
Just one comment.
Oh,
Before we get to him,
okay.
I want to clarify something. He said the Franklin sign, they made briquettes there, John.
Oh.
They made what?
Briquettes,
yes.
like charcoal briquettes.
Oh, the brigade plant.
Yeah. The reason they made them there, they had a huge waste pile of coal. It was taller than a 2.5-story building.
Uh-huh.
And it probably was, I don't know, 15, 20 acres. And for years they used that waste coal to compress and make briquettes, and they hauled them out on rail cars.
There you go.
Yeah, there were rails around there.
Yeah, that's the Franklin. I'm sorry for the.
No, thank you.
No, thanks
I
for
want to
having
say
me.
there where you were.
At least I wasn't hallucinating.
When I was a young guy, maybe 18 or 20, be up in Tower City where I met my wife, and you'd drive down the street and you'd see wash lines full of long johns in the middle of the summer. And I could never figure that out. Well, then later on I'd see people walking there were as black as coal. And that's not the way it was. Everybody lived with it.
Yeah. An interesting thing about Tower City that I found in my research is, so miners went in on shares together. They kind of thought of it like that. 3 to 5 might go in, and it was the miner, but also their family would work there. They were partners. They split all the money regardless of who owned the equipment or whatever, because we're all risking our lives. We're all using our labor to do it, and this is about survival, not a business, right? And so it was customary, I'm not saying it happened in every case, but it was customary that if a man died in the mines, that his share was given to his widow. And she would then work the mine until that particular hole was shot. But in Tower City, I wish I knew this woman's name. There was a woman who was just a miner outright, period. You know, who was a bootleg miner from that time. Who, I don't know what her situation was, because I'd love to learn more about her, but she was evidently in the same boat as every other person in that, like, I need to make some money, you know?
Well, when you go up 209, you call it Keppers Mountain, there's a water pipe coming down there, and the mountain filled up with water, and the water ran out, the pipe going in the ground, and there's where some people were lost.
Bus go down over there, isn't it? What? Didn't a bus go down over there?
Maybe.
Bushes at the top of the mountain.
But there's a, I didn't
I've been
the
down.
mountain's full of holes.
All right.
As a young girl.
All right.
I hope it
That was a bush coal company, I don't know if you ever over in the mountain. And the tunnels where he's talking about, right? The tunnel, up on 200, wash down into the tunnel? Porter tunnel.
Oh,
I call it, yeah.
Porter.
Porter tunnel, yeah.
Oh, okay, I've heard that name.
Yeah.
Because of Porter Tunnel.
And then my dad,
Yeah.
and then over to Bush Coal Company, that was up on the mountain, yeah. But I was in the bush, down in the bottom.
were you?
Yeah, I was. One time, there's no. I went down in one of the, wee little light, got that little, that. And the rats running around, yes.
Everybody used carbide lights.
Yes.
There was no electric down them holes.
Not at that time. I don't know when that started though. Maybe you? Or, sorry. No.
Some had generators, they had lights, some used carbide, some had, you know, the battery on their belt. You know, probably depends how much money you had.
I forgot. I forgot to tell you guys. I forgot to tell you guys a really good story about like writing this book, right? Which is I was just living in Trevorton. I was just reading about the area, and I saw a mention of bootleg coal. And you know, I grew up around some of the independents, and they call them bootleggers. But I found some mention in the books, but not many, not much that I could find. The most I could find was a book that had like 3 pages on bootleg coal. And so I started digging in, and I wrote like an article on a blog I had at the time on the internet. And people really liked it, and a friend of mine told me keep digging, look for anything you can find, but this is, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. Like, there's nobody alive from back then. I mean, there are people alive from back then, but no miners alive from back then, right? But then I found out that there was a guy from Minersville in the 1980s and early 1990s who was writing a book about it. And he went around and interviewed about 40 of the last remaining miners from the 1930s from that time. But then he got in a car accident and died. And I managed...
My dad was one of those, but I don't know what his name was.
What's that?
I said, my dad was one of those that he came.
Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute.
But I don't, yeah, he was.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't remember but I know they did, yeah. My dad was one of those.
Well, so I tracked down this guy's widow's phone number. She lives in Michigan, and she had saved all the stuff, and was just like thrilled that somebody wanted to pick it up. And once I had all these interviews, that's when, well, I had never thought I was going to write a book, you know, but like that's when a friend of mine who had written a book was like, you have way more stuff than I ever did. And that's like what the book's based on, is those people's stories. Everything I find from the newspapers and reports and things like that, it's all to shore up those stories of people's lives. What was you said it was your dad, your grandfather?
My dad.
Your dad, what was his name?
Patch Banger, they called him Junior.
Okay.
Somebody came and
Okay.
he wasn't, they didn't want to really do that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well that means there's at least one more interview out there.
Because he was a foreman for the Big Bush all his life, and the tunnel, so he knew pretty much, But I have no idea who did it.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So Mitch, you mentioned that the railroads, major railroad companies, tended to own these coal mines. So is there any difference between Reading Anthracite and the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad Company? Are they connected? 2 different divisions?
Yeah, that is so complicated because they kept running antitrust suits against them, And whenever they would break them up, then they would find a new way to reorganize. And so, I should show it to you sometime, but the government did a report on bootleg coal mining that's like this thick in like 1937, 38. And one section of it is trying to figure out who owns which company. And they made this chart that looks like, just like in TV shows when they try to tell you somebody's crazy and they have these strings all over the place. That's how they had their, like, the board of directors for all these companies. They weren't, like, owning each other. They just had all the same board members, you know? So one person, you know, you might be on 3 boards, you might be on another 2 boards, but you share one board together. So, you know, like, it gets really messy really fast, but at the end of the day, it was all JP Morgan money. Yeah. Any other questions?
You know, when you drive up this valley, all the way up to Tower City and get to the top of the mountain, you're driving up through on the right side of the mountain. That's pure spring water. You get in these bottles that you're selling. On this side of the mountain is all sulfur. Big time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, bootlegging. I mean, coal mining isn't great for anything. I mean, it's great for it's great for heating your house, but other than that, it's really not. Yeah, obviously good for what's around us. And a lot of people interviewed, you know, environmentalism wasn't like such an idea back then, but they still didn't like to see it, you know, but felt like their back was against the wall, and can't go fishing, but you can mine more coal.
When I met my wife up there, they had a Model A in the garage, and she didn't know what she wanted to do with it. Well, some guy came by and bought it, took it up to the mountain, and just like you had, put the cable on the rear, and this guy would sit there and shift it, take it out, put it in. But that's where they used the old Model A. That's where they ended up, down with the paint.
Yeah.
I can hardly believe that.
Okay, so my family says, my Aunt Patty there, that I need to tell you this other story, which is I had asked my pappy, John Tobias, he hung out at the Gratz BFW, if you ever met him. Toby. But, you know, he was just always telling jokes, that's what he did. What?
No, this is true.
And so I had asked him, while I was researching this, I had asked him a couple times, do you know anything about bootleg coal? And he would just tell me some joke about, like, he used to have a mule named Jack. You know, jackass. And I was like, yeah, you told me that last time I asked you, Pappy. And I didn't really get anything out of him. Until I was, I found in some archive somewhere, this photo down here you can take a look at later, which is the governor actually came out and visited the bootleg mines. And took a tour of like Schuylkill, Northumberland, and all this up and all thing. And I showed my pappy that picture. And the first thing he does, get pissed off. That ain't no miner. I know, Pappy, it's the governor. You know. But then the second thing he says is, oh yeah, my brother Merle ran the winch. Like, what winch? Well, that's the family bootleg. Like, where was that? Well, Down City. Like, yeah, it's just wild how something doesn't come up, you know, if nobody brings it up, and it's been just that long. I mean, he was a teenager, right? But born in '32, so he wasn't even a teenager yet, actually. But it's just wild how something like that could get forgotten. Yeah, that's why I wrote a book. How are we doing for time, or keep going? All right.
I mean, if we have more questions, we have more questions. If not, I will have a business meeting, and we'll let them give time to ask questions and look at the display too.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Any other questions? Comments?
When are you writing your next book?
Stop that.
I won't say it.
I don't know. It's going to be about you, though, if you keep that up.
I close out the career for you.
Yeah.
When Likens and Williamson, my mother told me all about, they would have their ball game on Mitchell Day, and it had to be one of the very few games in the world outside of this area where they didn't use lime, they used cold dirt lime field. Can you imagine whenever it looked like the line was over?
Yeah, I bet other teams love coming to play on the game. Yeah, and I hope they played in the daytime too.
Oh, yeah, they didn't have lights like that.
Yeah.
But they had plenty of cold dirt.
Cool. Well, with that, I think we'll follow what you were saying. From a thing I did like this before, maybe brief intermission might help people who want to look and leave before the business meeting because I don't want to interrupt. So